Thank you, Chair Brown. And I noticed that the colleagues, our colleagues were just skipping right over your formal role of handing the ball from one of us to the other of us. So, but
I'm on the Finance Committee for a while. Thank you.
That's right. I really appreciate this committee and all of the testifiers today. I want to just start by thanking my colleague, Senator Rounds, for bringing up the issues around Native housing. Senator Rounds is the ranking member of the Housing Subcommittee that I chair, and I'm looking forward to working on those issues with him there, and also issues of rural housing and discrimination in rural housing, which is such an important issue. And I really also appreciate the conversation today about the federal legacy of housing discrimination and what we can do to turn that legacy around. Today, though, what I'd like to focus in on is the ways in which local governments' policies have had discriminatory impacts and what tools we have to address that and to encourage zoning reform at the local level. So many zoning laws, we know, at the local level were created to racially segregate neighborhoods, even after the civil rights laws outlawed overt housing discrimination. And in fact, these zoning policies that restrict high density housing options were often intended to limit racial and economic diversity in certain neighborhoods, and were aimed at maintaining or even raising housing values in areas that were mostly where white families lived in single family homes. Now, in Minneapolis, this is one of our worst legacies. We have some of the worst housing disparities of any place in the country. And in an effort to flip that around, in 2019, Minneapolis adopted the 2040 plan, which is a long-term planning document that includes support for local zoning reform. And they developed housing priorities specifically with the goal of expanding access to affordable housing and quality housing everywhere in the city, where the city is actually quite segregated to this day. The plan, for example, would reduce minimum parking requirements for new housing production. It would legalize triplexes citywide, and it would allow for bigger residential buildings to be built along transit corridors. And one of the goals was, of course, to increase housing supply, but also another specific goal was to reduce racial disparities. So I'd like to ask, if I could, Ms. Rice and Mr. Reese, if you could comment on this, if you could comment on whether you think the 2040 plan is going in the right direction, what the impact is of local zoning requirements and reforms like this, and what the federal government can do to encourage zoning reforms like this to move us towards a more anti-racist policy. Ms. Rice, why don't you go first?
Sure. I was going to let my colleague Jason go first.
Either one.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Senator Smith, for that question. We absolutely think the 2040 plan is the kind of plan that local jurisdictions need to be undertaking in recognizing the role that local governments have played in fostering segregation. Look, many of the exclusionary and restrictive zoning ordinances that were put in place during the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s were put in, and even up until today, were put in place to restrict the ability of people of color to move into those neighborhoods. In fact, the first time that the disparate impact doctrine was used under the Fair Housing Act by the Nixon administration was to address a exclusionary zoning ordinance that the city of Blackjack had put in place in order to keep out residents of color. So this is a long-standing tool that has been used to create segregation, and these zoning ordinances, as I mentioned in my statement, are still in place today, and they're still serving their purpose of driving racial inequality. So one of the reasons why we're still seeing the disparities that we're seeing when it comes to racial disparities is because so many of these systems are still in place and they're still serving their functions. The federal government can help and create incentives for jurisdictions to eliminate exclusionary zoning ordinances by essentially applying, as I said before, the affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate to all of the areas to which it should be applied. AFFH should be applied not just to housing, but also to community development. And if we do that, we will see much broader voluntary compliance with the AFFH provision.
Thank you. Mr. Reese, I'm actually a little over time, but I'd love to hear your comment briefly, please.
Yes, thank you, Senator. What the Twin Cities is doing now, the whole country is looking at, because it does potentially set a model going forward about how we can reform zoning laws, particularly laws that limit anything other than single-family housing. My one word of advice, looking at the scholarship around this, is that density alone will not produce affordability unless we're attentive to making sure that other kind of inclusionary housing tools are in place, things like community land trust, supports for home ownership for first-gen homeowners, and also then the alignment of other kind of subsidized housing within these spaces as we up the density within these places. I do think there is also a role, in addition to what Ms. Rice noted in terms of AFFH, of incentivizing and thinking of ways to get local communities to collaborate together to reform these laws. Regions are going to be more economically sustainable if these land use regulations are aligned across regions. And the problem is, it takes resources, it takes time planning to build the relationships, to get the consensus and the buy-in to do that. I referenced the Sustainable Communities Initiative. I think that's a great example of how you can run a competitive grant program that encourages this kind of multi-jurisdictional collaboration to take down these exclusionary barriers that we know are so detrimental and so deeply intertwined with our racial equity issues today. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair
Thanks,
Brown.
Senator Smith.